A new law in Iowa allows school districts to take general bond referendums to voters during a November election. This means more voter turnout and two fewer opportunities each year for schools to put a bond on a ballot. In November 2023, the vast majority of bond proposals in Iowa failed, but this funding is vital to school districts maintaining their infrastructure. How are school districts seeking to overcome these challenges as some prepare to take bonds to voters this fall in November, and many school districts asking voters to renew the physical plant and equipment levy? I want to thank our Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, and our panelists for being here. We have Tim Verhaan, Vice President of Business Development at Miron Construction, Matt Gillespie, Managing Director of Public Finance Services at Piper Sandler & Co., Chad Schumacher, Director of Operations for the Cedar Rapids Community School District, Michael Kleen, an architect with Shive Hattery, and Rob Demise, Vice President of Research with School Perceptions. Thank you all for being here.
No problem. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Let's talk about each of your experiences working with schools and school infrastructure. Can you briefly tell me what that looks like in your roles? Chad, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So as the Director of Operations here at Cedar Rapids Community School District, we look at the daily operations and making sure our buildings are up to standards and warm, safe, and dry for our kids. But we're also looking to the future and how we can improve our buildings through the funding that we get through the different buckets, which we'll talk about today. And so it's kind of always looking to the future, but also what are we doing today to make things ready for our kids to be in school?
Yeah, Michael, what about you?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do is definitely help school districts help make their buildings as efficient as possible. Looking at operational cost, and when we design buildings, really making them durable and usable for the school district while not costing an arm and a leg.
Sure, Tim?
Sure. So at Myron, we work alongside both our design partners like Shive Hattery and school districts to not only put costs together for what these improvements are going to cost, but also to help them phase projects, make sure that a set amount of work can get done over a summer period, which is pretty important in the school world. So we help plan, help budget, help with the messaging, help with explaining the needs of districts and why that's important. And we also help manage some of the facility planning. Not every district is fortunate to have someone like Chad that's full-time dedicated to facilities. So a lot of the rural districts, we help them, put together maintenance plans and stay on top of roofs and all those things that require ongoing maintenance.
Matt, tell me about your role.
Yeah, good morning. Here at Piper, it's either myself or one of my three partners are kind of beginning with the school districts, the school boards, generally helping them understand what their mathematical capacity is to borrow based on different levies, based on what state law allows, et cetera. And then we help them through the process, if it's a bond issue like this November, with community meetings, helping citizens understand if there's going to be a tax impact, property taxes. And then presuming that the bond issue passes, we assist that school district through the process of actually issuing the securities, the bonds, and getting the money into their hands so that they can actually begin to pay the architects and construction folks to build the facility.
Yeah, and Rob.
Well, at the moment, my role right now is to make sure the dog doesn't yell at the mailman. So that's priority number one. Priority number two, we figure out if people are going to like it. So Chad knows his buildings in and out. What's wrong with them? Why are they not up to snuff? How could they be better configured classrooms and the boilers that are going to fail and whatnot? Tim and Michael figure out plans to fix those, and Matt figures out how much it's going to cost. We put that into a very readable format for taxpayers and community members to say, this is what we're proposing to do. Do you like it? Would you support this at a bond? Yes or no? And if not, what did we get wrong? What is it that we could do differently? Is it a matter of the projects? Is it a matter of the timing? Is it a matter of the cost? What is it that you like and don't, so that the school district can either take a plan to ballot if it looks like it's going to pass and be supported by community members. If it's not, how do you go back to the drawing board? What is it that people are reacting to that they don't like? And how can that plan be different the next time you take that plan back to them, whether it's in a survey or bond?
I want to remind our guests here, please submit your questions. We have a wealth of information here, so I'm excited for this conversation. Let's talk about the funding stream available to school districts to address infrastructure needs. Again, Chad, would you start us off there?
Sure. So there's many different buckets of money that we use to be able to fund the infrastructure of our schools. As you know, we have the PPEL, which is the physical plant and equipment levy that some school districts would choose to use. It's a levy that we would ask the community to support. That goes. What we use that for primarily is the maintenance of our schools. We use that to make sure that we can replace things that go bad or improve our facilities in that nature. There's also the save bucket. That's our 1 cent option sales tax money. I call that the money that comes from those that visit our state. So when Rob comes down to watch Iowa play Wisconsin, he's spending money in Iowa City and he's giving back to the school districts through that that purchases that he makes. And then we also have the bond money that we can also ask our constituents to support as well. And so the bond would be, again, a vote on some taxes, increases to your property taxes, and that does have to pass by 60% majority. And so those are kind of the three buckets that we use here in Cedar Rapids. I know there's some other funding streams as well, but primarily that's what we use here in Cedar Rapids.
How do school districts make decisions about what facility needs to include on, say, a school bond referendum? Rob, you might have some insight into this.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of the bridge, I guess, is where I would start that conversation. So again, somebody like Chad who's going to know their building top to bottom. And really, for your average taxpayer, especially in a community the size of Cedar Rapids, they don't know. They don't know how old the boiler is. They don't know when the windows were last installed. They may be very engaged. Even grandma and grandpa go to basketball games, but they may not make it past the concession stand, while they're waiting in line. They don't know what the science labs are like. And, maybe I graduated in 65 and I turned out just fine. Why do you need something different? Obviously, education has changed over the course of 2 generations. And so what we need to say is, here's what we know is wrong based on the homework that the district has done. Here's what we're proposing to do about it. People don't necessarily want to make your plans. That sounds hard. That sounds like something that's going to take me a long time to respond to on a survey. You tell me what you're going to do. I'll tell you whether I like it or not. And then this team here would have to go back. And again, like I mentioned before, if the plan is supported, great, you're off to the races on a bond. If not, well, then what did we get wrong? But when I mentioned we're the bridge, one of our biggest pet peeves is something like modern, innovative 21st century learning environments. The hell does that mean, right? Like, that's a classroom to literally anybody else in this world, including most of the people that are going to vote in elections. So call a spade a spade. Don't try to sound salesy, because people don't want to feel like they're walking into a used car dealership. You tell me what's wrong. I'll tell you whether I like it or not. I'm going to fix it. So again, going back to your question, we want to make sure that we're describing the problems accurately, but in a way that people understand and in a way that relates to people so that they know, okay, this is what you're going to do and this is what's going to cost me. Because if there's any hint of confusion, nobody says, well, I don't really know, but I am going to raise my property taxes. Nobody thinks like that. So you got to be really clear in what's wrong in as few words as possible. Get to the point. Don't sugarcoat it.
Michael, you're doing some of that boots on the ground work right here in Cedar Rapids as the district comes up with a new facility plan. Can you talk about what that's like to find what the needs are in a school building?
Yes, so the needs can vary depending on the age of the building, and allows us one of the most important things to do is to walk the buildings, walk the sites. We'll be able to identify, are the buildings accessible? We'll be able to identify things like, is the mechanical system operating the way it should? A lot of data that we get from the districts allow us to understand that, and we're able to compare and contrast and provide benchmarking to provide that type of information. A lot of things that one thing we'll point out is codes change. And so something that you might have a building that's built in the 60s, it might have been code compliant then, but if we were to do an addition or renovation to the building, it kind of makes that we now need to bring the entire building up to the building codes, the current building codes.
And Grace, if I can jump in real quick, I think another important piece to this is the involvement with our stakeholders. Through the company that Rob works for, we utilize his services to send out a survey to over 60,000 or around 60,000 of our registered voters. and we got a lot of information back. About 10,000 of those people responded to that to give us some information on the last bond and what worked and what didn't work in the last bond and what we need to do moving forward. We also have engaged conversations within the community, talking to individuals and asking them what they felt about the last bond and what we need to do in the next bond go around. We've also started a task force with the help of Shive Hattery and MA Plus to really work through with a select group of people, of 80 plus people on a monthly basis, to really hone in on all the data that they collected through those walkthroughs and to share that with them, and then come up with a plan that we would like to present as options to the public. So that stakeholder involvement is really an important piece to this puzzle as well.
Yeah, could our other panelists chime in on that? How do you see other school districts involving their community on making these decisions before they want to take something to a bond referendum?
Sure, I'll jump in. So just last night was at a Benton Shellsburg meeting. We actually used Rob on that project to do a survey, and they initially intended to go out for referendum this November. Survey results came back with a split between Benton and Shellsburg. You got two small rural communities. The needs and what the voters would support obviously differed between those two communities. So we decided to pull that off and go through an entire another series of community meetings. We've brought in community leaders, business owners, parents, non-parents, and just walk them through and figure out, what is the happy medium? What would you support in a referendum? As Chad mentioned, there's several buckets of money that schools can use in Iowa. So it's a combination of how you fund those things and what portion of a project might go out for GeoBond versus what might use SAVE or PPEL dollars for. So it's a process. Not every school district is the same. Sometimes you have very active community members and sometimes you don't. So each one is pretty unique, but I'd say the consistent thing is you can't over communicate. There's a lot of people that are the majority of people that vote on bond referendums don't have students in the district. They're typically elderly and unattached. So how you get their input, because their vote matters. I
guess Tim's thought about being in a community as recently as last night triggered certainly community involvement is critical, but I would also say when you do it is probably just as impactful. Certainly you're going to get the folks that you wonder, are they the loudest or are they the most numerous? And sometimes you plan a meeting and 4 people show up and you already know what they're all going to say. And usually it's 60-yard indoor turf facility, a new pool, and the new auditorium seats. Nobody shows up and say, boy, those air handlers are looking a little rough up there on the roof. Nobody knows. So you're going to get projects that may not be what you need right off the bat, and nobody shows up waving a flag for those little, those non-sexy projects. But that's really what keeps the lights on and the water running, literally, I guess. So I think you do need community impact, but if you know what you need done, then I think it's more of a matter of saying, we know we need these things, folks. Are there other things beyond that? The guts of the school, what's inside the walls, we need to make sure is in good shape. We can ask the community for other things, but let's be real, folks. We can't replace a pool while the roof's leaking over the 3rd grade classrooms. And you want to go into these meetings knowing what's already wrong and knowing maybe a semblance of what a plan is going to be. Because again, people want to give you feedback on a plan. If you start from scratch and open up the doors and say, what do you want to do, folks? There's a good chance it's not going to match what you need. And again, nobody knows buildings better than Chad. He knows where the roofs are leaking and where the boilers are going to fail. And you got to start with that stuff. That's really what's most important.
I think what Tim said was interesting too is a lot of these voters don't have kids in the school district in this moment. So how do you explain to the community why their school facility matters to the community and not just to families and kids?
I think there's a direct connection to the economy of your district or the city that your district is in, or the multiple cities or communities that your district is in. There's a direct correlation between successful and updated schools to the success of those neighborhoods around them. And so really making those connections to say, investing in schools is an investment in the community, and the long-term benefits from that is people moving into those neighborhoods and people moving into your district. So I think if you can make those connections, of why that's important. I also think it's important to look at the schools that we're replacing are typically about 70 years old, is about the lifespan of a typical school. And so if you think about 70 years ago, that was about the time the baby boomers came. So the baby boomers' parents' generation invested in those buildings for that generation. And now it's our turn for our generation to invest in this next 2 or 3 generations down the line. So making those connections with the people of your community, I think is very important.
Yeah. Our population is different. Teaching and learning is different. Where people are living in communities is different.
Yep.
So a newer law in Iowa allows districts to take general bond referendums to voters only during a November election. So this is cutting down on the opportunities schools have. And with the presidential election this fall, that means there's going to be a larger voter turnout than most elections. How does this differ from previous practice? How does it impact the outcome of bond referendums?
Well, I would speak to that at least initially. Certainly, we had before that law changed a couple years ago, um, schools and other municipalities as well could have general obligation bond elections 3 times in certain years and 2 times in other years, so 5 times out of every 2 year cycle. And then several years ago, they could do it 4 times every year, so there was 8 times out of every 2 year cycle. So, and then before that, maybe 15 years ago plus, the school could do it just about any Tuesday they wanted, as long as they were staying outside of certain federal election dates and didn't interfere. So this ability for schools to have these elections is obviously been narrowed dramatically. And what the impact I see is, of course, it makes us busier, but that's really not, of any concern to the legislature, that they can do what they want. But it also means that, out of, let's say, 31 schools that are voting this November, which there are, certainly not all of them will pass, but a considerable amount of them will. And that means that all of these folks that are on the call today, these architects, engineers, construction managers, et cetera, they will be spread thin, because there will be all of these construction projects happening, presumably within a reasonably similar amount of time. And there's only so many, construction firms, et cetera, that are qualified to do this type of work. So I foresee it making projects actually possibly more expensive. I hope not, but when everybody's bidding all at once, instead of possibly bidding out projects, 3 or 4 times throughout the year, I think that could be a big detriment. I think one of the goals of the legislature, which is a good goal, is to have more people voting. That's obviously good. We'd like to see more people voting all the time. The reality is it just doesn't happen. Even this November, which will probably have record turnout, we're still not going to have majorities of people voting, probably. So it still is a relatively minor group of people that are going to have a say, because the other people just don't care, they're too busy, they forget, etc. So I personally see it adding costs to these projects, because everything is narrowed into such a small period of time. Maybe some of the construction folks can disagree with me or agree, but speak to that topic.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, Matt. We've got several projects. I think we have a total of 8 projects that vote this November, 2 of which are in Iowa. So it certainly adds to our workload. I think maybe an unintended consequence of that too is that you probably lose one construction season as well, because for the most part, school districts are not paying folks like Shive Hattery to design plans fully out yet before the November vote. They want to see how the election turns out before they spend those dollars. So by the time you find out that your referendum is successful, then you start design. You've already missed the following summer, where most of the schoolwork happens, especially renovation projects that have to happen when school's out. So you're probably missing the construction season, which obviously adds cost with inflation. I guess that's also part of the factor as well.
Yep, I'll jump in real quick and talk about maybe a smaller school district that might be just like a single middle school or a single high school. And if they have a space need where they've run out of space, and that if that bond were to fail, it just kicks the field goal down the line. So then that means those school districts that have a failed bond now have to live with the pain for at least another year, if not longer, to try to get that solution passed.
Yeah, I think to speak to that, Michael, I think a lot of community people, and I listen to this from my own father who says these types of things. Oh, the school it failed. They're just gonna keep bringing it back until it passes. Well, I mean, there's a little bit of truth to that, of course, but the reality is the reason that the school is bringing that project, and I'm not going to say that every single piece of every single project is absolutely necessary, but the big picture of the project is necessary. It's not that it was just the superintendent or the school board president that came up with some grand idea and put it forth. There have been significant amount of work put into these thoughts between the school board, administration, staff, outside folks like the architects, engineers, community people that have been putting ideas into it. So when the initial vote fails, and then the district, as Michael said, you have to wait a year. It really is for a project. At least the majority of that project is probably necessary or needed to some degree. So you are adding cost, unquestionably. The school is going to bring it back. Maybe they would have brought it back after 6 months, which used to be the rule. You had to wait 6 months. Now they have to wait a year. So those costs of interest, of course, interest rates can go up, they can go down. It could work to the advantage of the district by interest rates going down and the current rate, who knows? But there's always that risk that the cost is going to get significantly higher by having to wait for the district to do maybe a better job of educating the community. Maybe the first time they just didn't do a very good job of educating, the issue fails. So they have to go back and do a better job of educating the community, but the project is going to come back probably.
Yeah. And you might have, more of an uphill battle trying to re-educate people about what they already think.
Yeah, one thing I would just add to that is people always ask us, being in the construction industry, when are we going to see prices come back down? And if you look at industry trends, there's a lot of publications that we subscribe to. Historically, they haven't. They don't ever come back down. A big portion of construction cost is labor. I don't know when the last time anyone volunteered to take a cut in pay, but that's pretty rare that happens. And so typically construction prices continue to rise. So I think the longer you wait, the more it's going to cost is a pretty safe answer.
We have a question from our audience here. Chad, you were talking about the correlation between successful schools and successful communities. So they ask, why would Cedar Rapids be combining schools and taking neighborhood schools out of neighborhoods? And what effect does that have on the community and the neighborhoods?
Sure. So when we take a look at our overall inventory of schools, we look at a lot of different factors. And so we really need to look at efficiencies from a cost standpoint. The data that we've collected over the last, how long has it been, Michael? A year now, almost, since we started this process. We were able to take a look at the cost to run a building. The human cost to run a building is much more greater than the actual physical cost to run a building, as far as heating, cooling, all those types of things. And so when you run duplicate human efforts, that does become pretty costly. And so as a district, to be fiscally responsible and look at how we're using our taxpayers' money, if we can take a look at how we can be a little bit more efficient in that regard, that's important. We also take a look at where those schools are at and how many people are walking to those schools, how many people are busing to those schools, how many people are truly in the sense of a traditional neighborhood school, and how can we make sure that we're providing quality educational experiences for our students across the district. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. We do have to take all those things into consideration. And so when we do take a look at what schools that we want to either combine or not combine, for instance, with Van Buren and Hoover and Cedar Rapids, we chose to replace those 1-for-1 instead of combining those schools because of the increase in enrollment and population in that area of the city. So we take all those factors into consideration. to make sure that we're making the right choices from a fiscal standpoint.
Yeah.
To speak to that real quickly, what I think a lot of citizens, and I'm not sure who the person is that's asking the question, if they're a citizen of the Cedar Rapids district, et cetera, but I presume most of the people that are on the call today are citizens of Iowa. So what I think a lot of citizens don't realize is that it really boils down to money. If money wasn't involved, then we would all love to keep all of our neighborhood schools. The district that I grew up in had three elementary schools in the community. Everybody would like that to happen. Everybody would like their kids to be able to walk only 3 or 4 or 5 blocks and be able to be at school. But the reality is it costs money, not just in human terms, like Chad just explained very well, but it costs money, period, to keep those facilities open. And where is the money coming from? Well, the only place it's coming from is you and me as taxpayers. We're either paying income tax, we're paying property taxes, we're paying sales tax, some type of taxation that the state is taking in, or the district may be taking in directly, that is funding those things. So the pot of money is not unlimited. So, we can't expect our schools or cities or counties that are building other types of facilities to just keep replacing and expanding facilities that are there, because the money is not unlimited. And we see that when these bond issues fail. People are saying, don't raise my taxes. I don't want to pay more. But then on the flip side, they're saying, but don't close my local school.
Right.
Well, oftentimes we cannot have our cake and eat it too in the world that we live in. It just isn't possible. So we have to look at the big picture as a taxpayer and as a citizen and parent, and realize that our wants, my personal wants, maybe have to be trumped by the fact that my school district doesn't have enough money, and the people in the community either aren't willing to pay more, which is perfectly fine. That's all of our prerogative to vote no, or maybe the state funding system is not funding sufficiently to keep all of those elementary schools open, for example. So there's a lot more involved than just the final decision that the school board is making to maybe close an attendance center or merge them, et cetera. It's not just, oh, let's close that school down because it's old. There's other things that are involved. And for the sake of saying something very obvious, I would remind people to pay attention to what their school board is doing by paying attention to the agendas that your school board posts and your city and your county. They're posting those agenda items for a reason. By law, they're required to. So if it's important to you, what's happening in your local community, pay attention to what those agendas are. Show up to school board meetings, voice your concerns, run and become a school board member yourself. Learn more about that process. Instead of, unfortunately, what we see a lot of times is that people really only pay attention 3 weeks before there's actually an election. And then they wake up and say, hey, I didn't know this was happening, or I wanted my local building to still be here. Well, this process has been going on for 2 or 3 years, this discussion. And we have to be aware of that. As citizens, we have to take some responsibility for educating ourselves too.
Yeah, I'm gonna give the Gazette a shameless plug here and say a good way to stay informed in your local school districts is to subscribe to your newspaper. I do a lot of reporting on school facilities, and I'd love for you to read about it. So, Matt, going back to maybe you have a larger statewide view of this issue. Are you seeing more schools closing, quote unquote, neighborhood schools, combining schools for those financial reasons?
Yeah, for sure that's happening. Now, I wouldn't say that there's any kind of rush to do it. We see it happening maybe, once or twice a year across the entire state where, one existing facility completely is shut down. So I wouldn't say it's super common yet, but it does happen, and it's not uncommon either. And really the reason for it happening is the finances, because if finances, like I just said, if finances were not an issue, which of course they are, there would be we could fund all kinds of, we could afford to put new boilers in all those buildings and put two teachers in every building, a math teacher in this building and a math teacher in this building, when reality is if you had them combined, that same math teacher could teach all of those kids throughout the day, those types of things. So yeah, we do see it happening. It certainly brings community members out with more interest. At East Marshall schools, for example, they're voting here in November as well. One of their, one of the parts of their components of their project would be to close one of the elementary schools or close one of the school buildings, which, people in that particular community, that's a district that has several small communities. They look at it and think, why are you picking on my community, or why are you closing my school down? Well, again, it's not that the school board wants to do that. It's that they're really getting to a position where they have to do it because the finances just aren't sufficient to cover everything that's needed for all those buildings.
Let's talk more about what schools are taking bonds to voters in November during a presidential election cycle. I know Centerpoint here in Eastern Iowa, Centerpoint, Urbana, Williamsburg, Highland, those are just a few school districts looking at bonds next month. So what does this look like for these school districts as they try to engage and educate voters, maybe who, like we've talked about, haven't been involved in school districts before?
Well, not to keep the focus on me, I'll just try to say a few words, and then I know for sure Rob probably has some information about this too that might be really helpful. But there's 31 schools that I'm aware of that are voting this November. There are more schools that would be voting. There are several schools that chose not to vote this November simply because of the political situation. That it is a presidential election, etc. And what that ends up doing, I try to tell those schools, don't make that decision, because it's just the same thing as having voted and having it failed. You're forcing yourself to wait that extra year by choice rather than letting the community tell you that you must wait a year by defeating your bond issue. But by them waiting because they didn't want to wade into maybe a political sticky type of election, they have automatically probably increased the cost of their project automatically simply because of inflation by whatever that might be, 3%, 4%. That inflation is coming down significantly, so that's a good thing. But there is still inflation, and the cost of the project is going to go up. And they've now chosen to accept that cost increase simply because of the political scenario of voting at the same time that it's a presidential election, rather than maybe trying to vote at a time when they could really focus that voter on only their project. Maybe it's the only thing on the ballot, and people aren't having to think about all of the other things that come with this particular November, but any presidential election in particular.
Sure.
I've been taking some notes as you were talking, Grace, and I wrote, so preemptive apologies for the word vomit. One of the reasons I ended up at School Perceptions, when I was doing my dissertation work, basically Chad outed me as a Wisconsin kid. I am a Wisconsin kid, so do what you will with that information. But basically my goal was, there are certainly factors that affect whether somebody's going to vote yes or no on a school referendum. And my job that I assigned myself is, well, what factors matter? And I quantified 62 of them, and then basically ran some regressions to say, well, which ones matter or don't? It's everything from the cost of the referendum to when it's going to happen. How much is it going to cost me? Not just the total number. When's the last time you've had one? To community characteristics. What's the income? What's the educational attainment, and so on. A couple thoughts about that. One, I'm not convinced yet. Maybe I'll put my foot in my mouth eventually. I'm not convinced that just holding referendums in November is going to matter all that much. So I'm looking at my other screen here. First off, the timing of when you hold an election, at least in Wisconsin for that matter, matters very, very little. In April, we have most of our elections. Usually they're April every year, and then November every other. Sometimes you get a smattering of August and February in Wisconsin, but we're not that different from Iowa in that case, where we have one, maybe two a year in April and November. Obviously, the bigger the election, the higher the turnout. So focusing on turnout, the tax impact of whatever you propose is 4.5 times more important. It's more impactful than when the election is going to take place. How you're going to use the money, let's say you're going to use it for athletics, that's 6.5 times more impactful than when the election is going to take place. In fact, the turnout aspect of it is really no more important than what is the average income. It's really no more important than how many people have children in the district or households within the district. It really doesn't matter a whole lot. People want to know, what are you going to do with my money? Why is that project needed, and why is it needed now? I think the bigger, I wouldn't call it an issue, just maybe the hurdle, you got 60% that need to say yes for a bond. Wisconsin doesn't. You're very much more like North Dakota in that sense than you are Wisconsin and Minnesota. All it takes is 50% plus one in Wisconsin and Minnesota to get that. Interestingly, as turnout goes up in Wisconsin, the more likely a referendum is to pass. Minnesota's different. As turnout increases in Minnesota, the likelihood a referendum will pass declines. I'm curious how Iowa's going to shake out when you force people to vote in a higher turnout election and look at that change. But I think the threshold is a much bigger point. The other thing I would say is when you hold an election too often, people are just going to get mad at you. So let's say we work with a district in Wisconsin and they have an April election and it fails. If we do a summer survey a couple of months later to say, hey, we went back to the drawing board and we're going to do these few things, people are going to say, look, my life hasn't changed a whole lot in 8 weeks since you asked me at last. Why are you back to me? Nothing's changed. And you're often going to get more mad. You're going to get more anger, and support actually goes down if you ask me too soon. Don't talk to me yet. I'm not ready to talk to you yet. My paycheck hasn't changed in 8 weeks, and neither has the inflation rate, and the Fed hasn't done anything either. Don't talk to me yet. So the fact that you got to wait a little bit, I don't think is a bad idea. People want to know that you're listening. If you're back too soon, people are going to say, why did you ask me? You already made up your mind. Why are you back to me so soon? Now, I get the point that it may increase costs a little bit, but people need time to digest, and they don't want you to come back too soon. Otherwise, it feels like you're not listening to them. The last thing I'll say is I only vote in one school district. So, for instance, there's about 421 school districts in Wisconsin. Just under half of them, about 193, are going to have at least one question on the ballot. I think there's like 240 questions on the ballot in Wisconsin in, well, just under 30 days here. What's happening next to me? I don't pay taxes to this district next to me. I pay taxes where I am. I really don't care what they're doing with their tax rates. So I don't know that it matters how many are on the ballot at one time because I only see one. I pay taxes to my school district and that's it. So I guess, again, maybe I'll put my foot in my mouth. I'm not convinced that it's going to have that big of an effect yet. And I am very curious, are we going to be more like Minnesota, where the likelihood goes down as turnout goes up? Or are you going to be more like Wisconsin, where the likelihood something passes goes up the higher the turnout is?
No, I think that's really interesting. So we're still waiting to see what this November law how that impacts the results of these bond elections.
And Rob, I would be curious too, and I don't know how you would figure this out, but I would also be curious to see the process of how you communicate what your plan is to your community, or the intensity of that communication. What impact does that have?
Yeah.
Because I feel like the process that we're going through right now is really trying to educate our community on why this is so important. That back to your point of, I don't want to pay taxes, or I don't want to have to pay extra taxes, but if I am going to have to pay it, tell me why, so that I can support it. So that impact, I think, is going to be really interesting too, because I feel like the process that you go through as a school district, and how do you quantify that qualitative data, right? That would be really interesting to figure out that piece of the puzzle.
No, I won't bore you with my own research a whole lot, but you hit the nail on the head there, where after I figured out whether a referendum would pass in the community or not based on these factors, then I went to the communities where I was wrong and said, oh, I really thought you'd pass. Why did it fail? Or vice versa. Really thought it would fail, but it passed. What you said there, which is almost impossible to quantify, well, the ones that passed, it's because they had a campaign committee outside of the school with people that I knew. I went to church with them. I got brunch with them. I got Bloody Marys with them every Saturday. I play euchre with them and sheephead on Wednesdays. Like, I know who they are. And you're speaking to me. You're not building a healthcare wing when everybody around here is electrician or plumber, or, whether it's a historic nature of the community or whatever. Your communication needs to come from somebody that I trust too, that I know. And that's probably the most impactful thing you can do. And it's impossible to quantify. So you're exactly right.
And Chad, could you just briefly explain how school districts can't advocate for or against their own bond referendums?
Yeah, so that Yes Campaign committee is actually vital to our success as well, because we can tell you there is a vote. We can tell you the things that we're asking you to vote for. We definitely don't want to say vote yes, because that's as a public entity that accepts public funds, taxes from the people in the community. we can't have a stance on a yes or a no vote now. Obviously, we probably know that we all support it if we're putting it out there and asking you to vote on it. But so again, that piece of the puzzle is very important, and that, Rob, is a very interesting you say that too, because it's not only that you have a yes committee, but it's the right people that you put in place for that yes committee, and those that are recognizable, but also those that, again, you go to church with, or you can say, I've talked to that person in the community, and I respect what they're saying, and I believe what they're telling me. So yeah, that it's difficult because we have to try to get that grassroots effort. But we have to really rely on others to do that grassroots effort. One example of that was when we did go out to vote on our PPEL just this last month in September. We actually passed by 72% yes, whereas the last time we tried to pass it, it was by a number of votes, 30-some, 20-some votes that it passed. And so I think that through the communication that we did and the grassroots effort by our PTOs, our PTAs within the community, and how they address that topic with our families was really the thing that put us over the edge. And it was interesting when we looked at our voting data, it was actually the 20 to 30-year-old age range that we had a really big spike in voter turnout for the yes votes. And I think that contributes right back to the fact that our PTAs and our families were out there talking to those families in the school on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's those young families who maybe otherwise would be too busy, really, to know what's going on at the polls.
And I go, and I not to get all data driven here, but I love this stuff. But it also is interesting because it was a non-national election vote in September, and so we didn't see as many 60-plus-year-old voters coming to the polls during that election, and we saw a big increase in that younger voter because of the impact it has on their kids on a daily basis. So some of that interesting information there.
Yeah, we have just about 15 minutes left here. I want to remind our audience, please submit questions if you have them. But I want to go back to talking about the importance of school infrastructure to student learning and the student experience. Rob, you mentioned 21st century classrooms. What does that mean? Michael, you've been in schools a lot lately. Would you like to start us off and talking about that?
Yes. So to answer the question about 21st century learning, when you think about when students were graduating 20 plus years ago, that was really when things started to change. That's when a lot of technology was really starting to boom. And they're realizing that the school structure, the facilities were getting 50 plus years old. They're now 70. Some of them were still turn of the century ones. So when you look about it, the facilities themselves were not in alignment with how students learn today. Students, probably most of us on this call remember everyone facing the board, sitting in the same chair, being taught the same subject, being taught the same way. However, we've learned through how the brain develops. We're starting to take all that additional information and start really understanding, students learn at different rates. Students learn different ways. And so having a room of 30 of the exact same chairs facing the exact same wall may not be as conducive to learning for all those students as if you have different learning environments. And so that's kind of why we're starting to look at how do we create future ready facilities to allow for students to be to learn the way they need to learn to be successful for the future.
And one little caveat to that too is not only is it the design of the classroom itself, but 21st century infrastructure. And what I mean by that is the difference between an older light and LED light, or natural light coming into the building, or the proper oxygen levels within the building, because your HVAC systems are much more efficient and can bring in fresh air. And you can't discount those things that go into that as well, to say that those lead to students being able to have a good experience. And so it is about, the chairs and the furniture and all of those things. And that's really, really important. But just the fact of when you walk into a building that's super dark and the hallways are narrow and there's no space for them to spread out, and you're using steam water to heat your buildings, all those things can play into the effect of how that plays into your education. Window air conditioners versus a geothermal conditioned building, and having a high humidity on a warm day versus a very conditioned space. So all those things can play into the 21st century learning environment.
Additionally, I'd say the way the specialized education has evolved, it requires a lot more space. There's a lot more breakout learning sessions. There's a lot of one-on-one or one-on-two type learning environments. And a lot of these older facilities, it was classroom after classroom, and there's no breakout space. So you walk into an older school and you see that they've, taken a closet and turned it into a room for someone, teaching speech. And that's not a great, none of us want to learn in that environment where you're literally in a closet with a teacher. So the schools just weren't built for the way that kids are educated today.
Right. New schools, there's places other than hallways for students to be pulled out of classrooms for some one-on-one learning.
And I think Michael and Shive Hattery and a lot of architects are looking at how do we create spaces that can pivot and change as education changes. And so being when you design a 21st century learning environment, not only are you trying to design for how we're teaching today, but we have to have spaces that can adapt and pivot as things change throughout the future. And so that's the other piece to the puzzle, is that older buildings seem to be more traditionally built to accommodate those rows. But I think as we look at the new spaces, when things change, we can change along with that because we're building spaces that are adaptable.
What about the arguments I hear from people in the community that older buildings are sturdier?
I'll take this because in my previous life, I worked on a school that had a catastrophic collapse. That building got condemned. From the outside, it was a beautiful building. That had you done a facility inspection on that property, it probably would have passed. The structural deficiencies were hidden behind walls, and it had two ceilings. It had an old plaster ceiling, and above that was the structure. So without really doing some destructive demolition, you would never have been able to see the underlying issues within that building. And I'm not trying to scare anyone and say that all these old buildings are dangerous. They're not. But certainly those underlying issues exist. And that's why sometimes when you get into a building remodel, there's the unexpected cost because you end up addressing things that you just literally couldn't see until you got in there and started doing some demolition. So to say that they're more sturdy or they're built better, I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case. Certainly there's, especially when you're talking school planning, we do, we estimate close to $3 billion worth of work every single year. And there's certainly levels of construction for schools. So it depends on what a community is willing to invest in a school, of how long it's going to last.
And I think it's also important to understand that as we learn more about safety, not only can we build sturdy schools, but we have a code that we're required to add a storm shelter. So instead of having a school that doesn't have a storm shelter, as we build new schools, all of our kids would be able to be in a safe place if there was a tornado event. Other things of safety features like secure vestibules or lockdown procedures where we can push a button and all the doors shut if there was a situation where we needed to do those things. As codes change and as we learn more about how to build buildings, older buildings, yeah, they may be sturdy, but there's other factors that may go into that may not be the best. ADA compliance, the ability for a child in a wheelchair to get up to the third floor of an older building just isn't there. And so we can really start to talk about they're sturdy and yes, they got great bones, but how does that again affect the day-to-day operations and keeping kids safe, warm and dry?
And I think just to expand on what Chad said there, when we talk about ADA, I think everyone thinks about the mobility portion of ADA. Can you physically get there, you know, in a wheelchair or whatever? But there's a lot that goes into that. A lot of these older buildings, the restrooms, for example, are a huge point of ADA where they're just too small, and to get those to be compliant with the current code, you end up losing, you know, fixtures, toilets, all those things that then make your, you know, you're kind of going backwards. So there's a lot more to ADA, you know, the height of water fountains, and there's a bunch of stuff that goes into ADA compliance. It's not just, can you physically get to the classroom? Just to make that more clear, because I think that gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah. In our previous discussions, we talked a little bit about this. Matt, how are school infrastructure projects different than maybe the private sector?
Well, in the private sector, obviously whether it's me building something on my house, my personal home, or if I'm a commercial property owner, and I'm going to, you know, build a new commercial building or add on to it, I don't have to get the public's approval. So there's a huge difference just from that aspect. Obviously, we all have to still meet building codes, but if I want to do something in my private life, I can just do it for the most part. Whereas in the public world, it's not that simple. You know, we either need 50% approval if it's a PEPEL related issue, or 60% approval if it's a full general obligation bond. And it's really difficult, obviously, to get that type of approval from that number of people when we have such broad and diverse communities with different opinions and different histories, et cetera. So I'd say the number one difference, which is pretty obvious, is just that it isn't something that the school administration can just go do because they want to. They can do smaller projects that simply. They do have access to PEPEL funds and sales tax funds, but they're not going to do these major new building infrastructure projects because they just can't. They don't get enough funds from PEPEL or sales tax to do those types of large projects. So there's going to take an election, and therefore politics is going to get brought into it, for better or worse.
Yeah, there's also maybe more budget constraints.
Yeah, that's correct. The school is not. I think a lot of people misunderstand that their school board can just go out and build $1 trillion building if that's what they wanted. And oh, wouldn't they do that? And they, you know, it'd be this huge palace that's dedicated to the sweet superintendent that we love so much. Those things can't happen. There are limitations that do require voting as well, but the school district can only borrow up to certain tax levy limitations. Even with voter approval, they can only go to certain levels. There's only certain levels voted PEPEL from a tax levy point of view. And of course, there's only so much revenue generated from sales tax. So there's a levy, or there's a revenue constraint there. And then overriding all of that, which I think a lot of people don't know, is that there is a 5% limitation for all of our municipalities. So none of our municipalities in the entire state can have more than 5% of what their assessed property value is in total debt outstanding at any given time. And it's just the principal that counts. So a school district, let's say they have complete ability to get voter approval. You know, everybody loves the school. Everybody loves to pay taxes. Everybody loves more spending and borrowing in the community. So they can borrow up to, for example, a $4.05 tax levy if they have that authority because the voters gave it to them. They could borrow to $1.34 in their voted PEPEL, and they can borrow from sales tax up to, again, a certain, you know, revenue constraint. But if you add those three things together, it's going to be a fairly big number. But chances are for almost all districts, not everyone, but most of the districts, that 5% limitation is actually more constraining. So it becomes that 5% that really truly becomes the limit, and not just what voters would approve or what the district even needs. Many districts truly need more than what that 5% would allow, but they just can't do that because of the constraint of the Constitution.
We have 5 minutes left here, and we got one more audience question, so I want to see if we can focus on that. What amount of time and energy is spent on learning about current curriculums being used when making plans for facilities? This viewer says there are no small group interventions being offered with a new reading curriculum being used in the Cedar Rapids School District, and to say that there needs to be extra spaces for small group learning and one-on-one, that seems to be changing. There's a lot of arguments made for least restrictive environments. What does this mean for the classroom and the rest of students, and how does it lend itself to more collaborative spaces in these 21st century buildings? So how are you looking at current curriculum when making facility plans?
So I'll speak to that. We walk hand in hand with our academic folks within the district. When we start to look at programming, designing a building, a new space, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what, other than grade 1, 2, 3, 4, what other programming will be in our building? English learners, special education, other things at preschool, all those things that could be within our building. The other thing we are directly looking at when we design our buildings right now are things that we have adopted, like the instruction, the CKLA programming that we just adopted, college and career readiness at the high school. We are actually designing facilities for the curriculum. And so we want to make sure that we are developing spaces that accommodate the programming within the building. And so we walk lock, step, and barrel with our curriculum folks, and they're part of the design phase when we start to look at a building of a new facility.
Rob, what does this look like when you're doing like surveys of the community?
Well, we would translate that into things that people already know based on their own experience, because the people that are using the facilities right now are not the ones that are voting and may not have been in schools for a while. But I think what Chad just described are things that overall test quite well. Especially if a homeowner, you know, your furnace boiler in the case of a school isn't going to last forever. You know, your roof isn't going to last forever, your AC, your floors, and so on. If it's something that I have to do to my home, I get it. Those things test very well. People want to know that you're going to improve what you're in the business of improving. And if it sounds related to reading, or it sounds like it's related to math, reading, writing, math, those things are going to sail through. Whether the curriculum that you're using to do that matters almost none for our survey, because people aren't going to know what it is anyhow. Same in Wisconsin. If we talked about the new science of reading curriculum in Act 20 from the previous biennium budget, and then you got to spend 2 paragraphs talking about what that is and whether or not it should even been passed, yes or no. So we really don't spend a lot of time talking about that, but having spaces that are flexible for reading, writing, and math, people get that. I know when we worked with Cedar Rapids, they had some really cool programming going on with their CTE. We joke, not joke that in our comments, people say, do whatever you need to do to make sure my 25-year-old doesn't live in the basement. If it sounds like something that's going to be good for job training, people really like that. So the guts of your building, reading, writing, and math, and CTE programs, science labs, those things are going to sail right through. We're just going to talk about them in a way that people get and not get bogged down in the details of, well, here's why we're doing it because of a recent state law that required us to do this. I'm not going to read it. Tell me what you're going to do. Tell me how much it's going to cost. If I want more questions about why you're doing it, that's a great place for an FAQ on your website.
Yeah, and when we're talking about creating spaces for like college and career readiness, it's not just about like job training. It's about inspiring potential careers for these kids and getting them more connected with learning that way. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Well, I really appreciated this conversation. Thank you all for being a part of it. That's going to conclude our conversation on school infrastructure. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for tuning in. And thank you to our panelists for their insight and our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest. Go and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.